above Truk Lagoon. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai pressed his oxygen mask tighter against his face, scanning the sky through the canopy of his Mitsubishi ASX-M0. Below him, the American carrier task force crawled across the Pacific like insects on blue silk. His squadron, what remained of it, 12 aircraft from an original complement of 48, prepared for their attack run. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sakai had flown 73 combat missions. He'd survived Pearl Harbor, the Philippines campaign, and the brutal fighting over Guadalcanal. He understood odds. He understood tactics. He understood that most pilots in his position didn't survive to see their 25th birthday. What he didn't understand, what none of them understood, was why American anti-aircraft fire had transformed from a manageable hazard into something approaching a death sentence. 3 months earlier, raids like this one carried acceptable risks. You'd lose 2, maybe 3 aircraft to defensive fire. Unpleasant, but statistically survivable. Now, attacking American naval formations had become something else entirely. Something that defied every tactical principle Sakai had learned. The shells didn't just fill the sky randomly anymore. They found you. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. All aircraft, commence attack. The squadron leader's voice crackled through the radio. Sakai pushed his stick forward, beginning his dive. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 28,000 feet. 24,000. 20,000. Below, he could see the American ships maneuvering, their wakes leaving white scars on the ocean's surface. Then the sky erupted. Black clouds materialized around the formation, not random bursts scattered. Across empty air, but precise detonations that seemed to anticipate where each aircraft would be. Sakai jinked left, muscle memory taking over. A shell exploded exactly where he would have been. He rolled right. Another burst, 40 meters away, close enough that shrapnel peppered his aircraft's aluminium skin with sounds like gravel thrown against a tin roof. This wasn't normal anti-aircraft fire. Normal fire created a wall of explosions you flew through, hoping statistics favored you. This was targeted. This was personal. Every shell seemed calibrated to find flesh and metal. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nishizawa's aircraft, 300 meters to Sakai's right, simply disintegrated. No fire, no smoke trail, just there one moment and gone the next, replaced by a cloud of debris tumbling toward the ocean. Sakai hadn't seen what happened. The explosion occurred too precisely, too suddenly for observation. The attack dissolved into chaos. Aircraft scattered, abandoning their attack runs, trying desperately to escape the killing zone. Sakai pulled out of his dive at 8,000 feet, his aircraft shuddering with the stress. Behind him, 5 more aircraft were burning or falling. In less than 90 seconds, the squadron had lost half its strength without a single aircraft reaching bombing position. As he fled north toward Truk, Sakai tried to understand what he'd witnessed. American gunnery couldn't have improved this much through training alone. The shells were exploding at optimal altitude, optimal proximity, with consistency that suggested something beyond human calculation. But what? How could a shell know where an aircraft was? That evening, in the humid operations room at Truk, Sakai filed his combat report. The intelligence officer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who'd never flown combat, listened with obvious skepticism. "You're suggesting the American shells detonate automatically based on proximity to your aircraft?" the officer asked, his tone suggesting he was speaking to someone suffering from combat fatigue. "I'm not suggesting anything," Sakai replied, his voice flat with exhaustion. "I'm reporting what I observed. Their shells explode at exactly the right altitude and distance. Not approximately. Exactly. Every time." The intelligence officer made notes. The Americans have improved their radar-directed fire control. This is known. Better calculations lead to better results. Better calculations don't explain what I saw. No human calculation could be that precise, that consistent, across dozens of shells. Then what's your explanation, Lieutenant? Sakai had no explanation. That was the problem. I don't know. But every pilot who survived reports the same thing. The Americans have changed something fundamental about their anti-aircraft systems. We need to determine what. The intelligence officer closed his notebook. Your observations will be forwarded to technical intelligence, but without physical evidence, we can only document that American defensive fire has become more effective. More effective. The phrase was grotesquely inadequate. Sakai thought of Nishizawa, one of Japan's finest pilots, with 67 confirmed victories, reduced to falling debris in less time than it took to draw breath. That wasn't more effective. That was revolutionary. But revolution required understanding, and understanding required information Japan didn't possess. What neither Sakai nor his intelligence officer knew was that the shells killing Japanese pilots with such precision contained technology Japan couldn't replicate even if they'd captured intact examples. Each projectile carried a miniaturized radar transmitter, vacuum tubes smaller than a fingertip, circuits that survived forces exceeding 20,000 times gravity, and firing logic that made detonation decisions in milliseconds. The mechanism was elegantly simple in principle, brutally complex in execution. As a shell approached an aircraft, it transmitted radio waves at 180 MHz. Those waves reflected off the aircraft's metal surfaces. When the return signal indicated the target was within lethal radius, typically 30 meters, the fuse triggered detonation. 30 meters. Not at impact, not through timed calculation, not through luck. At precisely the distance where the explosion's expanding sphere of steel fragments had optimal density to shred aluminum and flesh. The Japanese had no name for this technology. They had observations, theories, increasingly desperate speculation, but they never captured an intact fuse for examination. American security protocols ensured that proximity fuses were used exclusively over water throughout 1943 and most of 1944. If a shell failed to explode, it sank into the Pacific, becoming irrecoverable. Even captured American prisoners couldn't provide information. Gunnery officers had been briefed on function but not mechanism. They knew the fuses worked. They didn't know how. Security classification was absolute. Questions were discouraged. The technology itself remained a mystery even to those deploying it. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most brilliant tactical minds and a principal architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, studied casualty reports with mounting alarm. Before June 1943, Japanese naval aviation lost approximately 1 aircraft for every 800 American anti-aircraft shells fired. By December 1943, that ratio had collapsed to 1 aircraft lost per 150 shells. The improvement couldn't be explained by American training or experience. Gunners didn't become 5 times more accurate in 6 months. Something had changed in the ammunition itself. We're fighting a weapon we don't understand, Genda told his staff officers. And ignorance is killing our pilots at unsustainable rates. The Americans claim better fire control systems, one officer suggested. Fire control explains marginal improvement, not transformation, Genda countered. Their shells detonate by proximity to aircraft. Multiple pilots report this consistently. We need to determine the mechanism. How can a shell detect an aircraft? Another officer asked. Radio equipment requires vacuum tubes, power supplies, antenna. The firing forces would destroy any such system. Then explain the casualty rates, Genda said quietly. Explain why our pilots deal with mathematical precision. Explain why attack runs that were marginally survivable 6 months ago are now suicide missions. No one could. The explanation required knowledge of American industrial capability, miniaturization techniques, and research programs Japan's intelligence services hadn't penetrated. The VT variable time fuse, designated to disguise its true nature as proximity-triggered, represented a convergence of technologies Japan couldn't match. Miniature vacuum tubes, developed from hearing aid components. High-frequency oscillators, stable enough to function while spinning at 30,000 revolutions per minute. Batteries that activated through firing setback and provided power for 20 seconds of flight. Each component required precision manufacturing at scales Japan's industry couldn't achieve. American factories, primarily employing women workers who had no idea what they were assembling, produced 40,000 fuses daily by late 1943. The workers soldered connections smaller than rice grains, assembled components under magnification, tested systems with Euler's precision. Japan's entire electronics industry couldn't have manufactured 40,000 units per month, let alone per day. The industrial gap was absolute. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, flying from Rabaul in April 1944, experienced the proximity fuse's lethality in what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission. His assignment, photograph American positions in the Solomon Islands, required no combat, no attack runs, just speed and altitude. He approached at 28,000 feet, well above effective anti-aircraft range by conventional doctrine. The Americans opened fire anyway. Nakajima watched the black bursts materialize around his aircraft, climbing to altitudes that should have been impossible for shipboard guns. Then one appeared directly ahead, perhaps 50 meters distant. The blast wave hammered his aircraft, shredding the port wing, puncturing the fuel tank, fracturing the canopy. Nakajima fought for control as the aircraft tumbled. He managed to stabilize into a dive, pulling out at 8,000 feet, and limped back to base with an aircraft that would never fly again. The maintenance chief examined the damage, pulling steel fragments from the wing's structure. These came from an air burst, he said, holding up a twisted piece of shrapnel. But the nearest explosion was at least 50 meters away. 50 meters should be survivable distance. It should be, Nakajima agreed. But their shells are designed to kill at that range. Whatever mechanism they're using, it detonates at optimal distance for maximum lethality. How would a shell know the optimal distance? Nakajima had no answer. None of them did. The technology was so far beyond Japanese capability that speculation itself seemed pointless. By mid-1944, Japanese air operations against American naval forces had effectively collapsed, not through lack of aircraft or pilots, though both were growing scarce, but through simple mathematics. Attack missions were losing 60 to 70% of their aircraft to defensive fire. No air force could sustain such attrition. The pilots still flew because orders demanded it, but everyone understood they were flying towards statistical certainty of death. What made it unbearable wasn't just the dying. Pilots accepted death as part of their duty. What corroded morale was the incomprehension. They were being killed by something they couldn't see, couldn't understand, couldn't counter. American shells found them with precision that suggested supernatural awareness. Diving didn't help. Climbing didn't help. Evasive maneuvers only delayed the inevitable. The psychological impact was devastating. Warriors needed to understand their enemy. They needed to believe skill and courage could influence outcomes. The proximity fuse removed both beliefs. Skill was irrelevant when shells detected and pursued their targets. Courage was meaningless when death arrived through mechanisms you couldn't comprehend. Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa, who would later achieve posthumous fame as a kamikaze pilot, flew his first combat mission in May 1944. He returned, shaken and confused. His debrief report, preserved in captured Japanese documents, provides insight into the psychological dimension of fighting an incomprehensible weapon. "The American shells follow us," he wrote. "If we climb, they explode higher. If we dive, they explode lower. Senior pilots say this is improved fire control, but fire control cannot explain what I witnessed. Their shells know where we are. They hunt us." The language, shells that know and hunt, reveals the cognitive framework Japanese pilots developed. Unable to understand the technology, they attributed intelligence to the weapons themselves. The shells became animate objects, pursuing with malevolent awareness. This wasn't superstition exactly. It was the human mind's attempt to create explanatory frameworks for phenomena beyond existing knowledge. Medieval Europeans, seeing comets, described them as omens. Japanese pilots, seeing proximity fuses, described them as hunting weapons. Both groups were constructing narratives to explain what they observed. The truth that American factories were mass-producing miniature radar systems and fitting them into artillery shells would have seemed equally impossible to 1944 Japanese pilots. The conceptual gap was too vast. Even if told the mechanism, they would have struggled to believe it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet, never lived to see the proximity fuse's full impact. He died in April 1943 when American fighters ambushed his transport aircraft. But his successors inherited the problem his death left unsolved: how to fight an enemy with systematic technological superiority. Vice Admiral Saburo Ozawa, who assumed command of carrier forces, reviewed intelligence reports with growing desperation through 1944. Japanese losses to American anti-aircraft fire had increased by factors that tactical adjustments couldn't address. Something fundamental had changed in American defensive capabilities. "We need technical intelligence," Ozawa told his staff. "Captured equipment, prisoner interrogation, anything that explains their improved effectiveness." His intelligence officers had little to offer. "American prisoners are gunnery personnel, not engineers," one explained. "They know their weapons work more effectively. Security around their new ammunition is absolute. What about recovered shells? None have been found intact. All combat usage has been over water. If shells fail to explode, they sink beyond recovery depth." Ozawa understood the implications immediately. The Americans weren't just protecting their technology through security classification. They designed their entire deployment strategy to prevent capture. That level of operational security suggested something genuinely revolutionary, not merely improved. "Then we adjust tactics," Ozawa decided. "If we cannot understand their weapon, we must avoid it." Low-altitude approaches, night attacks, weather exploitation, anything that reduces exposure to their anti-aircraft systems. The tactical adjustments helped marginally. Low-altitude approaches did reduce exposure time to defensive fire, but they also reduced the attacking aircraft's ability to maneuver and increased vulnerability to smaller caliber weapons. Night attacks worked better, though American radar-directed fire remained effective even in darkness. Weather provided the best concealment, but you couldn't schedule military operations around cloud cover. Fundamentally, tactical adjustments couldn't compensate for technological disadvantage. The proximity fuse had changed the basic calculus of air-sea warfare. Japanese doctrine, built on assumptions of acceptable attrition rates, collapsed when those rates tripled or quadrupled. Lieutenant Zenji Abe experienced this collapse firsthand during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. His squadron, 27 aircraft from the carrier Tsuikaku, launched against American task force. The mission briefing had been grim but straightforward: penetrate the American defensive screen, attack the carriers, accept casualties as necessary for success. What Abe encountered wasn't a defensive screen, it was an execution ground. The American ships opened fire at 18,000 meters, well beyond what Abe had believed was effective range. the sky filled with black bursts, not scattered randomly but clustered around the formation, following as they maneuvered. Within 2 minutes, 8 aircraft had been destroyed. Within 5 minutes, 17 were gone. At 4,000 meters altitude, a shell exploded 30 meters to his left. The blast wave flipped his aircraft inverted. He fought for control, managed to roll upright, and found himself at 2,000 meters, too low for an effective bombing run. His aircraft damaged, fuel leaking from punctured tanks. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. He jettisoned his bomb and fled east, skimming the wave tops, using the ocean's surface to mask his aircraft from American radar. Behind him, the attack dissolved completely. Of 27 aircraft that launched, 4 returned to Zuikaku. Abe's was one of them. In the ready room, he sat with the other survivors, none speaking, each processing what they'd experienced. Finally, Lieutenant Commander Takahashi, the air group commander, broke the silence. "We cannot continue operations like this. The mathematics are impossible." Everyone understood. 23 aircraft lost for no damage to American ships. If that exchange ratio continued, Japanese carrier aviation would cease to exist within a month. They had perhaps 200 operational carrier aircraft remaining across the entire combined fleet. 200 aircraft against an American force that seemed to have unlimited resources and weapons that defied conventional defensive tactics. "What killed us?" Abe asked. "I've flown 42 missions. I understand anti-aircraft fire. What we encountered today was different. Their shells found us with precision I've never seen." "Improved fire control," Takahashi replied, but his voice carried no conviction. "Fire control doesn't explain it." Another pilot interjected. "Their shells exploded at exactly the right distance. Not too close, not too far. Perfect distance for maximum fragment dispersion. Every single time." The discussion continued in circles, pilots trying to construct explanations for phenomena beyond their experience. Some suggested magnetic fuses that detected aircraft engines. Others proposed acoustic sensors that heard propeller noise. A few mentioned the possibility of radio-based detection, but no one could imagine how such technology could be miniaturized and hardened enough to survive artillery launch. They were groping toward truth, but lacked the technical foundation to reach it. The conceptual gap between their understanding and the actual mechanism was simply too vast. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that each shell killing their squadron mates contained components manufactured with precision measuring in thousandths of a millimeter. Vacuum tubes with filaments thinner than human hair, wound with techniques developed specifically for this application. Oscillators calibrated to frequencies that remained stable, despite spin rates that would tear apart conventional electronics. Batteries activated by the firing shock itself, using the enormous acceleration as a trigger mechanism. The entire system represented engineering sophistication that American factories could produce at a rate of 40,000 units per day, while Japan's entire electronics industry couldn't have manufactured 40,000 units per year, even with complete specifications and unlimited resources. The industrial gap wasn't just quantitative, it was qualitative. America was operating at a level of mass precision manufacturing that Japan couldn't approach. Captain Toshikazu Omae, serving on Admiral Ozawa's staff, compiled a classified technical assessment in July 1944. The document, captured after the war and declassified in 1958, reveals how close Japanese intelligence came to understanding the proximity fuse and how far they ultimately fell short. American anti-aircraft effectiveness has increased by factors suggesting fundamental changes in ammunition or fire control, WWII wrote. Analysis of combat reports indicates shells detonating at optimal range for target destruction with consistency that cannot be explained by improved human calculation. Possible explanations include radio-activated, fuses triggered by shipboard transmitters, magnetic fuses responding to aircraft engines, optical sensors detecting light intensity changes, or proximity-based detonation mechanisms of unknown type. The assessment continued with recommendations. Immediate priority should be given to recovering intact American shells for technical examination. Until such examination is possible, tactical adjustments should emphasize approaches that minimize exposure to long-range anti-aircraft fire. Omiya had identified radio-based proximity detection as a possibility. He'd understood that something in the shell itself was making detonation decisions. But he couldn't bridge the gap between theoretical understanding and practical implementation. How could such a system survive artillery launch? How could it be manufactured at scale? How could it function reliably in combat environments? The questions had answers, but those answers required knowledge of American research programs, manufacturing, capabilities, and technological sophistication that Japanese intelligence had failed to penetrate. By August 1944, Japanese naval aviation had been effectively destroyed as an offensive force. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as American pilots dubbed the Philippine Sea Battle, had cost Japan over 600 aircraft and countless irreplaceable experienced pilots. American losses? A few dozen aircraft, mostly to operational accidents rather than combat. The proximity fuse wasn't solely responsible for this slaughter, but it was a major contributor. Analysis of American action reports shows that ships equipped with VT-fused ammunition destroyed Japanese aircraft at rates 5 to 7 times higher than ships using conventional time-fused shells. For Japanese pilots who survived long enough to recognize the pattern, the psychological impact was crushing. They were dying to something they couldn't see, understand, or counter. Every mission became a flight toward inevitable death, distinguished only by how long you survived before the invisible hunter found you. Ensign Yasunori Aoki, who flew from shore bases in the Philippines, kept a diary that provides chilling insight into the mental state of Japanese aviators in late 1944. His entries grow progressively more fatalistic. September 3rd. Lost Tanaka and Yoshida today, both to American anti-aircraft fire, both to the exploding shells that find you no matter how you maneuver. We talk about them now, these hunting shells. Everyone has theories. No one has answers. September 17th. Commander says, "We're receiving special attack training." I understand why. Conventional attacks achieve nothing. We lose 70% of our aircraft before reaching targets. If we're going to D anyway, might as well be achieving something. At least kamikaze attacks guarantee you reach the target. October 9th. Volunteered for Special Attack Corps. Not from patriotism or desire for glory. Simply from mathematics. Normal attack missions have 10% survival rate. We all D eventually. Better to D meaningfully than to be blown apart by shells I never see coming. Aoki died on October 25, 1944, in the first organized kamikaze attack of the war, crashing his Zero into USS St. Lo. His diary was recovered from his footlocker and translated by American intelligence officers. The final entries reveal a young man who'd accepted death not from martial ardor, but from rational calculation. If you were going to be killed by weapons you couldn't counter, you might as well D on your own terms. The proximity fuse had helped transform kamikaze tactics from unthinkable to logical. When conventional attacks became suicide missions with near-zero success rates, actual suicide attacks started looking strategically rational. The irony was bitter. The same technology that made conventional air attacks unsustainable would later prove equally devastating against kamikaze aircraft. The proximity fuse didn't just excel at destroying maneuvering bombers. It was even more effective against diving aircraft on predictable intercept courses. But that development came later. Through the fall of 1944, the proximity fuse remained Japan's invisible killer, destroying aircraft and pilots with mechanical efficiency while remaining completely mysterious to those it killed. American intelligence officers monitoring Japanese radio communications noted the confusion. Intercepted pilot reports described American shells that followed aircraft, that knew where targets were, that exploded with impossible precision. The language revealed pilots struggling to explain what they experienced using frameworks that made sense within their understanding. Commander Joseph Rochefort, head of Pacific Fleet Signals Intelligence, compiled a report on Japanese perceptions of American anti-aircraft capabilities. Enemy pilots attribute our improved effectiveness to various causes, none accurate, he wrote. Some believe we've developed magnetic shells. Others suggest we're using advanced optical targeting. Several reports mention invisible wires or aerial mines deployed around ships. None have identified the actual mechanism. Rochefort noted the strategic implications. The enemy's inability to understand or counter our VT fuses provides significant tactical advantage. Their air operations planning proceeds from false assumptions about achievable success rates. This leads to catastrophic losses that compound their pilot shortage and accelerate the collapse of their naval aviation. The confusion wasn't limited to pilots. Japanese technical intelligence agencies, tasked with understanding American weapons development, produced reports throughout 1944 that came tantalizingly close to truth without quite reaching it. A November 1944 assessment from the Naval Technical Research Institute stated, American anti-aircraft shells appear to incorporate proximity-sensitive detonation mechanisms. Possible technologies include radio frequency detection, electromagnetic field sensing, or acoustic triggering. All identified possibilities face severe technical challenges in miniaturization and surviving artillery launch forces. Recommend immediate research program to develop countermeasures, though specific countermeasure design requires better understanding of enemy mechanism. The report's conclusions were grimly realistic. Even if enemy technology is identified and understood, Japan's current industrial capacity is insufficient for deploying comparable systems. American electronic component manufacturing exceeds ours by factors of 10 or more. Research should focus on countermeasures and tactical adjustments rather than attempting to match their capability. They understood they were outmatched. They simply didn't understand by how much. The 30-meter detonation distance, optimal for 5-inch shells against aircraft, represented countless hours of testing and analysis by American weapons designers. Too close, and fragments lacked the velocity to penetrate. Too far, and fragment dispersion reduced hit probability. 30 meters was the sweet spot, the distance where expanding spheres of steel achieved maximum lethality. Japanese pilots never learned this number. They never knew that the shells killing them were making split-second decisions based on precise distance calculations. They experienced the results: aircraft exploding in mid-air, friends dying without warning, missions that became suicide runs but never understood the mechanism. This knowledge asymmetry was strategic weapon in itself. An enemy who understands your capabilities can develop countermeasures. An enemy who doesn't understand remains perpetually vulnerable. The Americans maintained this asymmetry through extraordinary operational security, refusing to deploy VT fuses over land until December 1944, ensuring no intact examples fell into enemy hands until the war's outcome was already determined. When proximity fuses were finally used in ground combat during the Battle of the Bulge, captured German examples provided the first detailed look at American technology. German scientists reverse-engineered the mechanism within weeks, documenting the miniaturized radar, the vacuum tubes, the firing circuits. Their reports expressed a mixture of admiration and despair. Admiration for the engineering, despair at the industrial capacity required for mass production. The Japanese never captured intact examples. Their understanding remained fragmentary, based on combat observations, prisoner interrogations, and theoretical speculation. They fought the entire war without ever truly comprehending the weapon that had destroyed their naval aviation. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai survived the war, one of the few Japanese pilots to fly from Pearl Harbor to surrender. In post-war interviews, he reflected on the proximity fuse's impact with the perspective that only survival provides. "We knew the Americans had developed something new," he said in a 1953 interview. "We could see the results every day, but we never understood what. After the war, when they showed us the fuses, explained how they worked, I felt like I'd been fighting ghosts. We were dying to technology we couldn't see, couldn't touch, couldn't understand. How do you fight something like that? You can't, you just deconfused." The psychological dimension of fighting incomprehensible weapons became a subject of post-war military analysis. Studies of Japanese pilot morale through 1944 documented steady decline that tactical failures alone couldn't explain. Pilots could accept losses from skilled enemy pilots or effective tactics. They struggled to accept losses from mechanisms they couldn't comprehend. A 1947 Rand Corporation study noted, "The psychological impact of the VT fuse on Japanese aircrews exceeded its tactical impact. Pilots reported feeling helpless against American anti-aircraft fire, describing it as inevitable rather than probabilistic. This perception shift, from viewing defensive fire as survivable hazard to viewing it as certain death, contributed significantly to declining morale and the widespread acceptance of suicide tactics." The study concluded, "Weapons that operate beyond enemy understanding provide advantages beyond their technical capabilities. The confusion itself becomes weaponized, degrading enemy morale and decision-making effectiveness." By early 1945, Japanese pilots had developed fatalistic acceptance of American anti-aircraft superiority. Orders to attack American naval formations were understood as death sentences. Pilots wrote farewell letters before missions, distributed personal effects, and prepared for death as inevitability rather than possibility. Lieutenant Yasuo Kuwahara, who flew from Okinawa's kamikaze bases, described the atmosphere in his memoir, "We didn't discuss whether we would die. The Americans had weapons that made survival impossible. Their shells found you in the sky, exploded at exact distances to tear your aircraft apart. Flying against them wasn't combat, it was execution. We preferred kamikaze missions because at least then we controlled the manner of our death." The proximity fuse had achieved something unusual in warfare. It had made survival seem impossible to the enemy. Not improbable, not unlikely, but actually impossible. This psychological victory was as significant as any tactical advantage the technology provided. Thank you for watching. Not improvas, not improvable, TVT Revende. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe. The final statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. From mid-1943 through August 1945, American ships equipped with VT-fused ammunition destroyed Japanese aircraft at rates 7 times higher than ships using conventional ammunition. Over 5 million proximity fuses were fired in anti-aircraft roles in the Pacific Theater. Japanese casualty reports document over 4,000 aircraft destroyed by American anti-aircraft fire during this period, the majority attributed to the proximity fuse's effectiveness, but numbers alone don't capture the complete picture. The proximity fuse achieved something more profound than simple attrition. It broke Japanese air power psychologically before it destroyed it physically. Pilots who might have accepted casualties from enemy fighters or from conventional anti-aircraft fire couldn't accept casualties from weapons they couldn't comprehend. The 30-meter detonation distance remained unknown to Japanese forces throughout the war. They never learned the precise mathematics of their own destruction. They died at optimal range for fragment lethality without ever understanding why that range was optimal or how shells determined when that range was achieved. This ignorance was itself a kind of victory, not just technological, but epistemological. The Americans had created a weapon that operated beyond enemy comprehension, in a space where Japanese pilots literally couldn't understand what was killing them. The knowledge gap was as wide as the industrial gap and equally unbridgeable. When the war ended and American technical officers demonstrated proximity fuses to captured Japanese aviators, the reactions ranged from shocked silence to bitter laughter. Many simply didn't believe such technology was possible. Others understood immediately why they'd been dying with such consistency. Commander Minoru Genda, who'd spent months trying to understand American anti-aircraft improvements, examined a VT fuse in September 1945. He turned it over in his hands repeatedly, studying the plastic nose cone that protected the antenna, the compact cylinder that contained technology Japan couldn't have built in a factory, let alone in a shell casing. "How many of these did you make?" he asked the American officer presenting the briefing. "Over 22 million. Genda set the fuse down carefully. "We never had a chance, did we?" "No," the officer replied quietly. "You didn't." The proximity fuse stands as testament to how wars are truly won, not just through courage or tactical brilliance, though both matter, not just through industrial capacity, though that matters enormously, but through the ability to develop, produce, and deploy technology that operates beyond enemy comprehension. Japanese pilots fought bravely. They executed their training professionally. They died by thousands, and they never understood what killed them. The shells exploded at 30 meters, creating optimal kill zones with mathematical precision. The pilots never learned that distance. They never learned the mechanism. They simply died, confused and outmatched, victims of industrial and technological superiority so complete it might as well have been magic. That incomprehension was the proximity fuse's final and perhaps most devastating effect. It didn't just destroy aircraft. It destroyed the belief that understanding and courage could overcome material disadvantage. It proved that some gaps in capability are too vast for bravery to bridge. The Japanese pilots who died in 1944 skies, watching friends explode at precisely calculated distances, never knew they were fighting not just American sailors, but an entire industrial system that could mass-produce sophisticated electronics faster than Japan could train replacement pilots. That ignorance was merciful, in its way. Understanding the true scale of their disadvantage might have made even dying seem pointless. The radar proximity fuse killed with mechanical efficiency, turning airspace around American ships into mathematically precise kill zones. But perhaps its greater achievement was killing hope. The hope that skill could compensate for technology, that courage could overcome industrial advantage, that understanding your enemy and fighting harder could somehow balance an equation already solved by factories producing 40,000 complex devices per day. 30 meters. That was the distance at which democracy's invisible weapon exploded, close enough to shred aluminum and flesh, far enough to maximize fragment dispersion. Japanese pilots never learned that number. They died at that distance repeatedly, their final moments filled with confusion rather than comprehension, killed by mathematics they never understood, manufactured by an industrial system they couldn't match, in a war whose outcome was determined before they ever took off. The shells knew when to explode. The pilots never knew why. In that asymmetry of knowledge lay the complete story of technological warfare's future, written in vacuum tubes and radio waves, produced in millions. and remaining mysterious to those it killed until long after their deaths had become mere statistics in America's comprehensive victory. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.